All right, so we're back and diving into something that honestly feels straight out of a political thriller. It's the pre-inauguration phone call between, well, President-elect Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
This happened on January 17th, just a couple of days before Trump is back in the White House. And, it seems like everyone's trying to figure out, what does this even mean for U.S.-China relations going forward? You sent over some really interesting stuff for this one, news articles, some economic analyses, even pieces on Taiwan's history, which I found fascinating.
Uh-huh.
So let's, put on our detective hats, I guess, and see if we can sort of unpack what's really going on here.
Yeah, what's really interesting about this call? On the surface, it just seems totally normal, right? Two world leaders just kind of, shooting the breeze, saying they'll work together.
It is standard stuff.
But when you actually get into the details, there are some really interesting things that make you think, maybe it's not so straightforward after all.
Right, like the whole thing with Trump inviting Xi Jinping to the inauguration, which, Xi declined, but he's sending Vice President Han Zheng instead.
Exactly.
I mean, Timon, no other head of state has ever actually been to a U.S. president's inauguration. That's going to be a pretty big deal, right? I mean, symbolically.
Absolutely. It really shows how, unique this whole relationship is. It's kind of like, on one hand, you've got these two economic superpowers who are, super connected. But on the other, they're, rivals who have really different ideas about what the future should look like.
So they're basically trying to dance a tango while also, playing a game of chess at the same time.
Uh-huh. Yeah, something like that.
And speaking of chess, one of the first moves seems to be all about TikTok. Just a few hours before this call, the Supreme Court actually upheld the ban on TikTok, basically forcing the Chinese parent company to sell it.
Right. And it's interesting to see how Trump's position on TikTok has changed over time. During the campaign, he was really pushing for the ban, but now there's talk that he might be having second thoughts.
Really?
Yeah, some analysts are saying this might be because, he thinks that TikTok actually helped him win the election.
Wait, hold on. TikTok helped him win. How does that even...
Well, there's this theory that the algorithm on the platform was, maybe showing pro-Trump content more often, which could have, boosted his visibility with younger voters.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, this is just speculation, but
Right.
It definitely adds another layer to this whole already pretty complicated situation.
Okay, so we've got TikTok, which is a whole other, can of worms culturally. But I think we got to talk about the, not elephant in the room, maybe the dragon in the room, which is trade. Trump's big campaign promise was to put this massive 60% tariff on anything coming from China. So if that actually happens, what's that going to mean for, the U.S., China, and just the whole global economy?
Well, to understand what could happen, you got to get how tariffs work. Basically, it's a tax on things you bring in from another country, which just makes those things pricier for the average person buying them.
So if Trump just slaps a 60% tariff on, everything from China, wouldn't that make everything at Walmart crazy expensive?
Yeah, basically, and that's just the beginning. A trade war this big could set off a whole bunch of bad stuff. Chinese businesses would lose a huge part of their market, which, could mean job losses and just make things unstable over there.
Yeah, and American consumers would get hit too, right? I mean, everything comes from China these days, from clothes to electronics to, even parts for our cars.
Exactly. You'd see prices go up for pretty much everything,
Right.
which could then lead to inflation and people spending less overall.
So basically, nobody really wins in a trade war. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And it goes beyond just the money. Trade wars can make countries, not trust each other as much, make them more tense politically, and make it harder to work together on other global problems.
It's like a domino effect, right?
Yeah.
One bad decision, and it just knocks over all these carefully balanced relationships.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And that's why this call between Trump and Xi is such a big deal. They both know the stakes are huge, and they're trying to figure out how to, navigate all this without causing a total meltdown.
So we've got TikTok, we've got trade, both, pretty shaky situations.
Yeah.
But there's this other piece we haven't really touched on yet, and it's kind of a big one. Taiwan. This is where things get really interesting, because it's the one thing neither of them actually talked about during the call.
Yeah. And it's not like they just, forgot about it.
Yeah.
Taiwan is the most sensitive issue for China. They see it as, part of their territory, a province that has to be brought back into the fold, even if they have to use force. And of course, the U.S. has this long-standing promise to help Taiwan defend itself.
So the fact that they didn't talk about it is actually a big deal. It's like trying to ignore, I don't know, a giant panda in the room or something. But why is it so sensitive for China? Like, what's the historical, cultural context here?
Well, for China, Taiwan is really tied up in their sense of like who they are as a nation and this feeling of historical injustice. They see it as part of this century of humiliation, which was this period like in the 19th and early 20th centuries when China was weakened and a bunch of foreign powers came in and like carved up their territory.
So it's not just about like a piece of land, it's about righting some historical wrong.
Exactly. And it's about getting back what they see as their rightful place in the world, you know. You got to remember, for centuries, China was the dominant power in Asia. And then they were forced to watch as Western powers, you know, the U.S. included, came in and kind of took over.
So they see Taiwan as a symbol of like their past weakness, but also as a test of their current strength.
Exactly. That's why any move by Taiwan to become independent or any suggestion that the U.S. might not back them up anymore, you know, it just sends Beijing into a frenzy.
Okay, that makes sense. But if China is so set on, reuniting with Taiwan, why haven't they just done it already? Like, why not take military action?
Well, it's not that simple. A military invasion of Taiwan would be incredibly risky and costly, both in terms of, people dying and just the economic damage.
Right, I imagine the U.S. wouldn't just sit back and watch.
Exactly. And China knows that.
Yeah.
Plus, they got to think about how the rest of the world would react. It could really hurt their reputation on the global stage.
So it's like they're playing this really careful game, trying to show they're in charge without starting a huge war.
Yeah. And that's where things get really interesting. Because while they're not, attacking Taiwan directly, they are doing other stuff to show their presence and influence in the region.
Like what kind of stuff are we talking about?
Well, one example is all the military stuff they're doing in the South China Sea. They're building artificial islands, sending warships there, running military exercises, all to try to control this area that's strategically really important.
And how does that connect back to Taiwan?
Well, the South China Sea is a super important shipping route. It's also got valuable fishing grounds and, maybe even oil and gas. By controlling this area, China can basically put economic and military pressure on Taiwan and on other countries in the region, too.
So it's like they're squeezing Taiwan's lifeline, trying to weaken them without actually, firing any shots.
Yeah, you could put it that way. And it's a strategy that's making a lot of people nervous in Washington and in other capitals around the world.
Okay, so we've got TikTok, we've got trade, we've got Taiwan, all swirling around in this geopolitical whirlpool. But there's one more thing we need to throw into the mix here, and that's the whole global security situation. Remember, Trump and Xi also talked a bit about the wars in Ukraine and Israel during their call.
Right. And that's a reminder that this whole U.S.-China thing isn't happening in a vacuum. It's playing out on a world stage where, conflicts and crises in other places can have a ripple effect on their dynamic.
So how do those other conflicts, like what's happening in Ukraine, actually influence the U.S.-China relationship?
Well, first off, they create this sense of uncertainty and instability, which makes it harder for countries to, cooperate on anything. They also raise the stakes for any potential conflict because both sides are worried about getting pulled into a bigger war.
So it's like everyone's walking on eggshells, just trying not to set off some chain reaction of, violence and chaos.
Yeah, it's like we're all living in this pressure cooker, and the heat's just cranked up way too high.
That's one way to put it. And with all this, volatile stuff going on, it's tough to say, what's going to blow up first. But as we try to figure out what's what, there are a few big questions I think we got to keep in mind.
Okay, lay 'em on me. What are we thinking about here? Well, first off, will Trump's second term end up being all about this, full-blown trade war with China? Or will he actually, manage to make a deal? Remember, he's pretty good at making deals, and he might just use those tariffs as a bargaining chip to get what he wants from Beijing.
Yeah, that makes sense. He definitely likes to, play tough. But I wonder if Xi Jinping is even willing to back down. He seems pretty set on looking strong and in control,
That's a good point. It's not just about, the economy or who has the bigger military. It's about national pride and their whole worldview. China sees itself as this rising power, challenging the whole U.S.-led system, and they're not going to give up easily.
So it's a real clash of the titans, basically. Both of them trying to be top dog. Okay, so what's the second big question we should be asking?
What is Xi Jinping's plan for Taiwan? Is he okay with just waiting it out, hoping they'll come back peacefully? Or is he getting ready to do something more assertive. Remember, this is something that's really tied up in how China sees itself as a nation and all that historical baggage.
Right, and they've already shown they're not afraid to use force when it comes to, like, the South China Sea. So it's not crazy to think they might actually make a move on Taiwan at some point.
Exactly. And if that happens, it could be a huge crisis, maybe even pulling the U.S. into a conflict.
Okay, so those are two pretty heavy questions. Anything else we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that all of this is happening against a backdrop of things getting more and more unstable globally. We've got the war in Ukraine, the Middle East is still a mess, climate change is looming, and there are all these other issues that are like putting stress on international relations.
So it's kind of like the whole world's on edge, and any little thing could set it off.
Yeah, kind of a sobering thought. But in all this uncertainty, there's one thing I find really interesting. The potential for, like, unexpected stuff to happen. Things that could throw a wrench in everyone's plans.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, imagine, like, tensions suddenly escalating in the South China Sea, maybe some kind of naval incident that gets out of hand, or, a massive cyber attack that shuts down, like, essential stuff in either country.
Yeah, those are some pretty scary scenarios.
Yeah.
And it seems like that kind of stuff is happening more and more these days.
Exactly. And it just shows how unpredictable this whole relationship is. It doesn't matter how much planning and strategizing they do. There's always a chance that things could just, go off the rails.
So it's not just about the big names like Trump and Xi. It's about those wild cards that could change everything.
Right. And that's why it's so important to stay informed, to really understand what's going on in this relationship, and to be ready for the unexpected.
Well, you've definitely given me a lot to think about. So as we wrap up this whole deep dive, what's the one big takeaway you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the U.S.-China relationship is like the major force shaping global politics right now.
Yeah.
It's going to affect the economy, international security, even how technology develops, pretty much everything.
So we can't just ignore it. We got to pay attention, ask tough questions, and make sure our leaders are, doing the right thing.
Exactly. And maybe most importantly, we got to remember that even with all this, like, complexity and all the challenges, there's still a chance for a future that's more peaceful and, better for everyone. But we got to work for it through dialogue, understanding each other, and being willing to find common ground.
Well said. And on that note of, let's call it cautious optimism, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the heart of U.S.-China relations. It's been, well, a wild ride.
My pleasure. And remember, the story's not over yet. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.